Health, Psychology and Human Nature with André Sturesson. What is happiness? And is happiness more than just feeling good? And what do different people mean when they use the word happiness, such as ancient philosophers like Aristotle? What did he mean when he used the word happiness? Joar Vittersø, he's a professor in psychology, and he has spent many years studying and researching the ancient concept of Eudaimonia, the ancient concept of happiness. And he's also the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Eudaimonic Wellbeing, which I highly recommend if you want to get a better grasp of what Eudaimonia, the ancient concept of happiness, is. Now, I really enjoyed this conversation with Joar, so thank you, Joar, for the conversation, and I hope you will too. Good headset you have there.
Yeah. I'm supported by the University of Tromsø when it comes to headsets.
That's good. That's one of the things they invested in now during this time. That's great.
Yeah, and that's true.
yeah. All right. So today we're going to talk about happiness and eudaimonia and stuff like that. And I know that you've been reading about that quite a lot during the last couple of years. And I think we should just get it on and just start right off.
Yeah, to talk about happiness.
Exactly. And I think like when a lot of people when we use the word happiness today, I think that a lot of people think about feeling good when we say happy or happiness when we use that word in contemporary times. So what I was thinking about was that different people have used or still use the word happiness in different ways, right? Or
yeah, that's correct. And the different meanings that happiness can take on are quite diverse, actually. It used to be a term that was meant to include a kind of complete life in which you live in a morally accepted way as well as in a way that gives you good feelings. But as you said that there has been a development in how the term has been interpreted and understood. And today, at least in Western cultures, we often think of it as a feeling state. But not only that, I think there is a great variety even in modern times, even in Western countries. So it can sometimes refer to a feeling state, or it can refer to a bunch of feeling states. For example, everything that feels good are sometimes called happiness.
Yeah.
Whereas in more specific usage, it's kind of meant to be a very intense, normally short-lived feeling. For example, being in love is a prototypical happy feeling, and most people have some experience with it, and they know that it is extremely intense, can be, but it's not lasting. I mean, it's not something that you have your entire life. So even if you think of happiness as a feeling state, there are a lot of different ways that happiness as a feeling can be understood and interpreted and defined and so on.
Right.
But even if the term or the word we have used for a good life has changed, if you think of the origin of the word happiness, it comes from hap, which is something that happens.
Is that what hap means, or is that
what hap means?
Oh, interesting.
So it's something about having good luck, actually. So yeah, you can be lucky winning the lottery. In Norwegian we say vinnerlykke.
Yeah.
In English, I don't know, but you are happy with the lottery or something.
Yeah.
And that is pointing back to the original meaning that most cultures, I think, used to think of when they talked about happiness in their original language or original form. So it has to do with the belief people had in what life was, and people used to think more in terms of the gods are deciding, and we just are puppets in the god's string, so to speak.
Right.
So it's kind of a fatalistic worldview that was dominating some thousand years ago, and so the original meaning of happiness reflects this kind of fatalism, namely that there were someone deciding for you, maybe some gods or some angels or some demons or something, and if they are good to you, you have a happy life. It means
Right.
that all the circumstances in your life turns out good for you, and the feeling part was not essential for that kind of interpretation of happiness.
Right. So there's really like a lot of different meanings throughout the ages and throughout different periods of time, and so the word does really like have meant different things during different periods.
Yes, absolutely, and still do to some extent. And for example, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Independence Declaration of the United States in 1786, or when it was 79 maybe, and his famous proclamation that everyone has the right to pursue happiness, he thought of happiness as a very social construct. So it wasn't an individual feeling thing for Jefferson. It was more of a social kind of deal that you made with people that you lived in the same community as, or in the same society. So even since those words were written, the meaning has turned even more individualistic, and today interpreted less as a social duty or something you do together with others, but more something that you are responsible for and which reside inside you, like a feeling or maybe an attitude.
Right.
So that is taking more and more over, I think, this personal, individualized understanding of what happiness is.
Right. So that is something that I find pretty interesting, because that also gets a bit confusing in contemporary times when we use the word happiness. Because from my understanding, like ancient philosophers like Aristotle, for example, he also had the word happiness meant something else for him than what happiness means in general today. Yes,
absolutely. And it's, I think, hard to grasp how different the concept really is. If you compare what we think about happiness and what Aristotle thought about it, and other Greek philosophers at that time. But again, it was more oriented toward their view of life as something that you have to play around, so that the term that the classical Greek used for happiness was Eudaimonia, which has two parts, eu and demon. And demon is pretty easy. It's a demon. I mean, it's a spirit. It could be good or it could be bad. So you, the first part of that word, is good. So it meant that you had a good spirit watching you, guarding you, a guarding angel, so to speak. So that was the original word, or the meaning of the word.
What does that mean, like having a guardian spirit or something? What does that mean, like for the person?
For the person, it means that you have to have some good connections with the word of gods. I mean, it was, again, I think it's difficult for us to understand how ancient people perceived the world, because it was much more filled with spirituality and things you have to obey, otherwise the gods would be angry at you and could come after you and so on. And some people had guardian angels that were not so good for them, and they had bad luck in a way. I mean, they would maybe be unhealthy, or maybe they lost people who were there to them and so on. But if you had a good guardian angle, then your life would be a good one. I mean, and it was up to the gods to decide, and you were lucky or unlucky with it. So originally, happiness in that sense meant that there were some benign gods that looked after you, and that was good for you, right?
Right.
So that was the broader meaning, but and it existed long before Aristotle was born. Some people think that he invented the word. That is not the case. It was part of the language when he was born into the Greek society, and he kind of defined it more precisely as, and this is interesting, for Aristotle said that happiness or eudaimonia, it's the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue.
Exactly, yeah.
So, I mean, the soul, the idea of a soul is an old-fashioned word. It's difficult to kind of give it a scientific definition, and also virtues, you know, what are virtues? People discuss it. But I think the core of Aristotle's idea is that human nature, or by nature, humans are social, which means that we have to collaborate with others. We have to lead our lives in ways that doesn't harm other people. We have to behave morally good. And to him, morally good was to develop your virtues.
Right.
So the idea that happiness is to develop yourself as a moral being is, of course, very different from what we think about when we talk about happiness, or even eudaimonia in a modern sense, because then it's much more individualistic, it's much more oriented towards feelings, or at least mental states.
Right. Now, I think that is interesting also, because from my understanding, the moral virtues was very important, probably the most important thing from my understanding with Aristotle. But there was also non-moral virtues, right? To become like a more developed human being in things that also wasn't just to be a good person.
In those days, you think, or more modern?
I think in those days, or at least that's something that I read in your book, The Handbook of Eudaimonic Wellbeing. I think it was like another chapter somewhere that they wrote that the Aristotelians, or from those days, or from modern days, now I'm not sure, but that there were both the moral virtues, but then also non-moral virtues, like, I don't know, I can't remember them right now, but was more like having energy to move forward with your stuff, and being energetic and being patient, and I don't know, other stuff as well. Yeah,
that might be so. I'm cheating a little when I talk about philosophers, because I'm a psychologist and a philosopher, so I read about it quite a bit, but when you push me on the details of the Greek philosophies 1,400 years ago, I have some holes in my education, I think. So, but there might be, I mean, different versions. I guess there were a lot of different versions, and in those days the gods were half gods, half people. They came to Earth, and then they went back to the God's world, and back and forth a little bit. So it was very different. And I think the important thing is to realize that for them, happiness was something else, and then you come to the issue of who can define or decide what a term should mean.
Exactly.
And we can discuss back and forth, should happiness means a good moral life, or should it mean something else? And the practical way out of it is to agree about something, and then you have to use different words, I guess, to get the precise meaning of two different things.
For sure. And one of the very interesting things with this book, The Handbook of Eudaimonic Wellbeing, and your first chapter there, is that you also, like you mentioned, that there's a problem today with that people use the word happiness, and that we have different meanings of it. And in your book, and let me see if I got this right now, but you wrote something that the biggest problem is not differentiating between happiness as a state of mind and happiness as a complete life that goes well for the person leading it. So that's, I think, would be very interesting to talk about. So what do you mean by that? That the big problem is happiness as a state of mind and happiness as a complete life that goes well for the person leading it?
Well, I think that the idea of happiness as a complete life is it's very broad. I mean, in a way, it's logical impossible to say that I don't want to be happy if happiness is defined as the life that you would like to live, or more precisely, if there is something that you miss in your life or something that you would like to have as a part of your life, then you're not happy because then you're missing something. And so it's kind of a definition of the life that we would like to live. And it's logical impossible not to want to live the life you want to live, because then you don't want to live that life. But the problem is that with such a broad understanding of happiness, it's also difficult to kind of pin it down to something at least scientific, something we can discuss with some preciseness, because it can be anything. But there is also something, if I can follow up on this, a life that is good for the person whose life it is, because this last part there is it's interesting, because in a way it is good for a single person, which means that it is a different kind of goodness than moral goodness, because moral goodness has to do with other people, I mean groups of people. So here you see a distinction between what is sometimes called prudential values or prudential happiness, which is something different from moral values, because again, prudential is something that is good for you, not necessarily for other people, but that doesn't matter. I mean, it's only what is good for you that counts as for the person whose life it is. But then again, that is different from the Aristotelian, the original Eudaimonia idea, which means that you need to lead a life which is good not only for the person whose life it is, but for everybody in the society or in the community. And today you have a difference between philosophers who stick to the life is good for the person whose life it is, saying that this is a value-laden concept, whereas happiness in the psychological or scientific literature has no statement about whether happiness is good for you or not. I mean, they just try to describe it as, for example, pleasant feelings or an attitude or whatever, but the scientist as such is not calling it good or bad. It's he or she is just calling it pleasure or satisfaction or whatever, whereas philosophers take an explicit stance about the value of it and say, well, if you mean happiness is pleasure, then pleasure is good for you. Or if you mean happiness is life satisfaction, then life satisfaction is good for you. So there's still a distinction there between philosophy and psychology, but it is a bit different from the Aristotelian point of view and modern point of views when it comes to happiness.
But could we just take this forward, like really try to explain this, because I think this is quite complicated as well. Like if we can just take happiness as a complete life that goes well for the person leading it. Like in a nutshell, like what does that mean? If we would explain it like to a kid, like what does that mean?
Yeah, well, what does that mean? That is 2,400 years of literature trying to, to explain it. But I mean, in a way, it's good if you want it. I mean, if you have a preference for something and you get that, well, that means it's good for you. If it's kind of serve your interests, regardless of what happens to other people. I mean, as long as you are okay with something, as long as you find something valuable and it is included in your life, then that life is good for you. And if you miss something and you don't have it, then that life is not so good. And then the big question is, how should we define what is good? And some philosophers called hedonists, they say that the only good thing in life is pleasure, because pleasure is felt as something that you like to have. And everything else is just means towards that end, or instruments, or something that you would like to have because it brings you in the end more pleasure, right? I think that is a bad theory, but it's one very dominating theory that has been along for hundreds of years.
But I was thinking about, like, so this happiness as a complete life that goes well for the person leading it, does that kind of mean like that you have your ideal of like what life should be, and if your life is kind of like your ideal, then you're having a good life? Is it kind of like a recipe almost, or something, or like a recipe almost?
I think you can use that metaphor, and if you decide what kind of food you like and you make a recipe that ends up with serving that purpose, you lead a good life.
Interesting. So it's kind of, and then the problem then is, what then is a good life? So then we have like Aristotle, who has his views of a good life, and then we have like a modern psychologist, a hedonist, who has his version of what a good life. So it's kind of like different people have different recipes in a way for what we should aim at and what we should strive at to create a good life for ourselves, kind of.
Yes, and I think one of the differences between some of the philosophies of happiness, and certainly the Aristotelian one, is that they kind of decided the list for you. So that it's not up to you to decide. I mean, you may believe that smoking is good for you, and it turns out that it is not so good for you. And the hedonist would then say, well, I don't care. I mean, if I like smoking and it costs me 10 years of my life, that's my decision, and it's good for me if I have my preferences or tastes satisfied at the moment, and I'm willing to pay whatever costs there may come further down the road when that happens, if it happens, and so on. Whereas the more sometimes referred to as objective list kind of theories say that no, you're wrong. You would actually have a better life if you live like this and this and this. And that is sometimes referred to as a difference between objective well-being or objective happiness, people sometimes say, and subjective happiness or subjective well-being. And the big difference is that for the subjective branch or approach, it is completely up to the individual himself or herself. But in the objective kind of approach, then you are not the only or the final judge about whether your life is good or bad.
And that's such an interesting thing, I think, because I've been talking with some friends about this, and some people are like, who are somebody else to tell me what a good life for me is? You know, some people get a bit, a little bit annoyed almost, you know, when you hear that somebody else has a view about what others' lives should be like.
Yeah, that is very understandable, but it's also very interesting, because for most things, people agree that they have restricted information or understanding. I mean, if someone told you something about the universe, you would say, that's interesting, I didn't know that. But if I tell you that, well, if you live so and so, your life will actually be better. Then they say, well, no, I don't agree with that. And I can then kind of argue along with a lot of kind of scientific evidence. But then you can say, well, the evidence is one thing, but if I don't feel or if my attitudes are so and so, that's what happiness is about. It's not about something objective out there. It's something within my mind, and I'm the only one with access to my mind, and so you can't promote, you can't overrule what I think about my life. But then, I mean, I can go on and say, well, that's true. You know what you feel at the moment, but you don't necessarily know what you will feel tomorrow, and sometimes, or next week, or next year, or whatever. And then we can show that you are often mistaken about what you think brings you happiness, whatever happiness is for you. But if you define it as pleasure or as satisfaction or achieving some goals or whatever, then we can predict and tell you that, well, you are often quite wrong about understanding what leads to what you self think about as happiness. So even if you stick to the idea that at the end of the day, happiness is something that has to be anchored within an individual, and it's only the individual who has access to his or her own feelings, still you can make bad choices, because your choices won't lead you to whatever it is that you want to have in your life.
Right. I guess an example could be that, let's say that somebody is not doing any physical activity at all, not moving at all, just sitting still a lot. And then somebody tells you, like, if you will, like, if we say that happiness is feeling good, for example, let's just use that hypothesis. Then if we say that, no, but if you will start moving, then you'll probably feel better. And then the person says, no, I won't. And then, like, the person actually starts moving around and exercising. And then a year afterwards, perhaps the person says, my life is so much better now that I'm exercising. And the person 1 year ago didn't realize that, okay, then that probably my life could be better if I would do this. So it's kind of, I guess, kind of in a way that a later version of yourself perhaps knows more than like the previous one.
Yeah, that's a good example, and I think one of the lessons to be learned from happiness and other kind of research is that we should be more open, I think, about what is important for us in order to. I mean, it could be achieving something, but it can also be feeling something, and realize that we are often mistaken about what kind of life or activities will lead to the feeling we would like to have. But it's difficult, you know. I mean, most people realize that cell phones are stealing too much of their time, and it's solid evidence that cell phone use or media use, or at least too much of it, brings less happiness. Even if people want happiness, they can't. They are not, what to say, have the self-discipline to put away your cell phone all the time, or not all the time, but at certain times and so on. And the same with exercise, as you mentioned. I mean, I guess most people realize that eating a bit less and exercising a bit more would be good for them, but there are some challenges, and it takes some effort, and it's hard to change your habits and so on. And the same thing goes, I think, for happiness. But then you have to start thinking, well, if happiness is really the thing I want, then I should reconsider maybe if my strategy for getting it is right or wrong. Or maybe, I mean, happiness is not what you like in life. Maybe you like to stay faithful to your self-image, or the idea about your identity and so on. So yeah.
Right.
Maybe it's a myth that happiness is the most important. Maybe there is something else. I don't know.
Who knows? Maybe in 1,000 years there was somebody who will find it out.
Yeah, but I think that being open towards both what changes might do to you positively, and also what not change might mean to you is difficult to understand. I mean, open up a little bit for the possibility that you can be wrong about yourself is the first step, and then you can consider and reflect and think about the life that you would like to live, but open up a little bit about the possibility of being wrong. And I think that was also some of the ideas that Aristotle had when he said that, well, to be happy means not only to or the reason that activity of the soul in accordance with virtue was his definition of happiness was that only when you fulfill your human nature,
exactly,
you can be happy.
Right.
And the human nature will be fulfilled when you live virtually. And I think that there are something in our nature, or there are some lives that we live that are better attuned to or better fit with our nature. But I think Aristotle was wrong when he kind of idealized nature in a particular way. I think human nature is a lot of things. I mean, it's not all of them are very good. Sometimes we are aggressive, we are sometimes violent. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's good to be aggressive or violent, but it's definitely part of our nature. So it's not as easy as to say that, well,
exactly.
I mean, act according to nature. That is not good enough. But certainly most people, I guess, will agree that some circumstances, some environments are bad for you and some are good for you. And this match, I think, is important to both realize, but also, I mean, for me, these questions are about figuring out what are the important things in our lives and in our societies that are most important, because we are easily distracted from our important goals and maybe temporarily kind of pushed in directions that are, or we are, how to say it, we are easily led to be occupied with something that is spectacular and some clicks and something we'd like to know about, but it wasn't really important for us. But nevertheless, it was lured into it in a way. And for me, the constant reminder about what are really important in life is some of the missions, or maybe the most important mission of happiness research, to keep that debate alive.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also perhaps we should get into talking about eudaimonia and stuff like that. We mentioned feelings before, and you talked about some theories about the hedonist theories, which means that pleasure is very important. Like, why do you, or what except pleasure do you think is important for like a human being? If you will just like, is feelings good? Like, is feeling good all that matters for a person, or is there a lot of other things as well?
Yeah, I certainly think that feelings are one among several things that are important to us. And, you know, the hedonist idea that pleasure is not only an important thing, but the only value in the life is wrong, I think, for a series of reasons. For example, if you ask people what is important to you, and then you list a range of different values, pleasure is not very important. I mean, already 60 years ago, or at least 50 years ago, there were studies showing that one of the least important things for people was the feeling of pleasure. And that result keeps, I mean, I'm just now doing similar studies, and others have done it as well. And what we find again and again and again is that people say, well, it's not feeling pleasure that is important for me. Maybe satisfaction could be important, at least much more important than pleasure. But what people most often say is that, well, my family, other people, even being a good moral person is much more important to me than feeling pleasure. So I think that is a problem for hedonists, that they have this theoretically derived idea about what pleasure is, and they have some logical arguments that ends up with saying this is the only thing. But that is not true. I think it's plainly wrong, and I think they should be confronted more with both empirical data and also some inconsistencies in their thinking. But if we should talk a little bit about the nature of pleasure, I think it's important to realize that pleasure is one element about the feeling state. So a feeling state have different dimensions or different qualities, and pleasure is only one of them. And what is sometimes called qualia or the quality of a feeling is something different. And I think one example could be eating a chocolate. I mean, people who like sweets, they also like chocolate, and then you can taste it's sweet and it's pleasant.
Right.
At least if you're hungry. But when you are filled and satiated and overfilled even, then you can have a taste of a chocolate and still taste its sweetness, but it's not pleasant anymore because it's too much. And there are a series of examples and a lot of research showing exactly that pleasure is one dimension of a feeling state, but there are other dimensions as well. And I even think that you can be happy and feel displeasure or pain even. And I think one example could be if you are a mountaineer and you have spent a week or something to ascend some peak, Mount Everest or whatever, and then you reach the peak and you are completely exhausted and probably in a terrible, painful state, but still happy because you have reached maybe the goal of your life or something like that. So when people talk about pleasure as the only thing or one of the things, they should realize that pleasure is one among several things that we feel and that we appreciate feeling. So you can appreciate feeling pleasure, but you appreciate feeling other things as well. And sometimes you prefer other things on the cost of pleasant feelings.
Yeah. And with the example there of the mountaineer who is going up this big mountain and finally gets there, because I understand like pleasure is one thing. It's something that, for example, if we define pleasure as something that like if we eat chocolate, then we get this, like it tastes good and we get this happy feeling kind of. But then I guess like if you're up on a mountain, then you might not feel pleasure in that sense, but you might feel like purpose or a meaning, or you might feel like I did something, or that is not the same thing as pleasure, but it's still something that you experience.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is an important point you are making because at least for me, it points to the fact that people prefer varieties of feelings. So they can say, I don't want to maximize my pleasure feelings. I want to perhaps maximize, or at least I would like to have rich feelings, different kind of feelings. When I'm in a funeral, for example, and I lost a good friend, I don't want to feel pleasant or happy. I want to feel sad because I lost something that is very important to me. And so having appropriate feelings is of course important. And then, I mean, if you push the argument, you can point to people that are born with some kind of genetic effects that make them unsensitive or insensitive to pain, which is paradise for hedonists, but it's a hell for the people who don't feel pain because they don't take care of their bodies. They hurt themselves a lot, and most of them die before they are 20 because of carelessness. And the same thing you can say for a lot of feelings. For fear, for example, people who don't feel fear, they don't have good lives because they come into all kinds of troubles, and sometimes they also die prematurely and so on. So the idea that you can find happiness in only one feeling, being pleasure or whatever, I think is a bad idea because we prefer and we need a variety of feelings. And just the balance, I can agree, it depends, varies from people to people or from person to person. But the idea that you only need one kind of feeling is a very bad idea, I think.
Yeah. And I guess also sometimes you might even feel bad, like with everything. Let's say that, I think the point you made earlier about that we value different stuff. So let's say, I mean, people are even willing to give their lives for the people that matters for them. Say a parent give their life for a child, for example. And that is, I mean, that has nothing to do with good feelings. It's just, I guess, you can say what you think. But, I mean, that has to do with you value something in life. You value your children or you value somebody else. And that is something that is important in itself, kind of.
Yeah. That is a very interesting point or an important point, and I think if we are referring once more to my chapter in the Handbook of Eudaimonic Wellbeing, that chapter was entitled "The Most Important Idea in the World," and the reason I used that title was exactly that maybe by understanding these phenomena better, we also realize that you can actually have a good life that combines the concern for other people with the concern for your own feeling. And by defining or leaving out everybody else and just by definition focusing on the life that is good for the person whose life it is, then you kind of exclude that terrain that you are now pointing at. And I think that is a mistake, and I think we can find ways of living that is both both gives us good feelings and are in accordance with other people's need, that we can help other when they need it, and we can be collaborating good humans concerned about our own well-being, but also that of others. And I think that is, if you are going to point at one thing about the human nature, I think what is very unique for human is that they don't only care for their own well-being. Every living organism do that, I think. But humans are uniquely concerned about other people's well-being. And as you mentioned, your own children or family or people who are there to you, you can feel that you care about them, and it matters to you how they are. I mean, what they feel, and their well-being is a matter for you as well.
For sure.
And that's interesting, because then the idea of altruism, namely that you have to sacrifice something of your own interest and something for yourself in order to help others, are not always the case. Sometimes you really want to do things together with others, and you're really concerned about other people's well-being without feeling that I have to give something up because of my want for helping other people. So that was something about the most important idea in the world, and with the right attitude, I mean knowledge, or I mean there's something there I think that we can develop, and with that development we realize that the way we live affect other people's, and some way my life might affect other people I don't like, so my well-being is reduced if I'm too egoistic, or if I hunt too much pleasure, or whatever.
Right. Yeah, interesting. I think also you mentioned that, I think before, also something that I would like to pick up again. I think that you mentioned also in your book that eudaimonia is something about like which your goals you aim at, or something like that. Or I think you wrote something like that. Could you explain that a little bit as well? Because I think that is also kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's actually quite a big issue. It's the idea, I think, from Aristotle was that everything has what he called a telos, or a goal, or some purpose in life. And the good life for anything in the universe actually was to achieve its telos, or its goal. And for Aristotle, even dead things like a stone or a planet or whatever had the telos, and strive to reach it. And when it reached it, then that existence was perfect. And so, I mean, a stone falling to the ground reaches its telos when it reaches the ground, because that's where it's belonged, to put it a bit simple, I know. I guess
no, but it's great.
Experts on Aristotle would arrest me. But
we won't show them the episode.
No.
I'm kidding.
Good. No, anyway, today we know that living things have goals and non-living things don't have goals. So the difference between a dog and a stone is that the stone doesn't want anything, but the dog wants something. And what it essentially wants is something good for it. And I think that is a very basic insight that also has to do with this goal, or something we want to do. Because basically we want good things. I mean, we want not only friends, but we want good friends. We want not only meals, but we want good meals, good homes, good education. So this search for something good is very, very basic, not only for humans, but for everything that is alive. And I think it's understandable if you reflect a bit upon it, because if you want bad things for you, you would die sooner or later, and you won't be, so it's important for us to want good things, but it's also important to realize that the variety of things that brings us goodness is quite big, and it is important to try to figure out and spend time and take it serious. I mean, that is my perhaps most important part. We should take the search for what is good serious, and we should realize that we can have different lives that gives us good mental state, well-being, psychological well-being, but the sources can come from different things, and we should strive to live life that are also morally good and good to us at the same time. So this moral thing I would like back into science again.
Right.
And that is not so easy.
Yeah. From my understanding, it's not really included that much in the contemporary versions of like the neo-Aristotelians and stuff like that. But what you mentioned there is, I think, quite interesting. So what you said there is something along the lines that people want different things in their life, and they want different things. Is that because like the people are trying to make their life better or trying to have a good life, and because of that we have goals in order to make our life better? So we want friends in order to improve and make our life better, and we want like good food, and we want other stuff. So is that kind of the thing that eudaimonia kind of is, that it's kind of having this eudaimon, these good goals, which also creates a good life if you strive towards them? Or
yeah, I think that is the essence, at least, of classical eudaimonia, that you are only able to call yourself happy if you have reached certain goals, and it is our human nature that defines those goals. That idea has been transformed into a more modern and perhaps more individualistic idea about developing yourself according to whatever plan you have for yourself, regardless of whether that is good or bad for other people, for example. So maybe the move has been, or we have gone too far in individualizing eudaimonia. Then you get rid of the paternalism of saying, well, I know what is good for you, which is a difficult one, but it is still, to me, if you only care about your own pleasure, happiness is a very uninteresting concept, I think, because if you can get pleasure from whatever activity there is, I mean, torturing others, or I mean, killing others, or so, then it's not a good. Then it's an uninteresting category. I mean, it has only value as far as your well-being is also consistent with. There has to be more to a good life than just your personal feelings, I guess, and I believe many people agree with that, and it's probably a reason why this term eudaimonia has become so popular, because many people have something to add to the idea of a pleasant life or satisfied life, and their own little darling they like to put in, and they say, well, eudaimonia is a good term because then I can add my little thing into the idea of happiness, or into some concept of happiness that is already out there in the literature.
Right. But from my understanding, like the main thing about eudaimonia is to act in a way that develops you as a person, like do things that develop you. Would you agree with that, or is that, have I got it all wrong?
No, I agree basically, but I think there is one qualification there that is important, and that is the development you talk about must have something to do with improvement, with betterment. I mean, you have to develop in a particular direction. Because any kind of development is not the same as eudaimonia. And then you're back to who should decide.
Exactly.
So,
that's, yeah.
But to say that you develop skills that are terrible in some way, it wouldn't count as eudaimonia, I think.
Yeah.
But certainly to develop, to grow, is a part of eudaimonia, and it is not a part of hedonia or the classical subjective well-being approach, which is pleasant or positive emotions plus some kind of satisfaction with your life. And both those criteria could be fulfilled from a variety of different lives. And again, if any kind of life give you a good life, then it's an interesting category, I think.
Right. Yeah, because exactly. So then you get back to, okay, so if eudaimonia is like doing things that improve you, that makes you better, kind of. Because from my understanding also is that like from the original, like the Aristotelian view is that like virtue is very important. It's important to do things that develop you into a good person, basically. Do good things that makes you a good person. But the contemporary view is, or the contemporary theories is not as focused on that. It's more develop yourself, like different things, and also probably in your career, and also the moral things. But the moral things is not as important now as they were, or?
Yeah, absolutely. For many reasons, actually. I mean, one important thing is, I believe, during the Enlightenment period, around the 17th century, and there were philosophers like Kant and others made a more distinctive, separated more distinctly between the kind of good that is, again, prudential or good for the person whose life it is,
right,
versus the moral good. So there was a conceptual distinction between those two, which I think makes sense. But then also from then on, happiness, well-being belong to the individual part of that kind of goodness. So you have moral goodness, which concerns other people, and you have individual goodness, which concerns only yourself. So what you see, and you mentioned the neo-Aristotelian era, and what you see in philosophy and to some extent in psychology, but not so much, I think. But there are some thinkers or scientists that try to combine them. Is a return to the idea that Aristotle and the classical Greeks argued, namely that you can't exclude the social part of us as beings, as human beings. We are social, and there's no way around it, and that has to be included somehow. And I think that is a good starting position, but how to move from there is more difficult. But to accept it, I mean, is a big first step.
Yeah, for sure. And as you I understand it that you're doing in this book is that you try to. I think your chapter is really great in that way that you mentioned this. I think you have this table where you mention this, I don't know, 50 different definitions of eudaimonia. Like this philosopher says this philosopher says this, and you have that really makes you understand that okay, so this is a concept that a lot of people have different opinions about, and that has been discussed during ages and are still being discussed today, which from my understanding, or at least for me, it's been a bit hard to understand what it is and anything about it, because you read different things at different places. And I think that's a good point of your chapter there, that it's something that there's a lot of versions of it and opinions about it.
Yeah, I think that too. And it can be very confusing if you are looking for a particular answer, like when you try to figure out how much 2 plus 2 is, then there is a certain answer to that. And in a lot of sciences, you have kind of answers to your questions. But for the question, what is eudaimonia? I don't think there is an answer, at least not at the current time, because there are just too many versions of it, and it's difficult to, I mean, you can't settle.
Sorry, people.
Yeah, sorry, people.
There's no answer. No, I'm kidding. No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, but I mean, the thing can improve. I think that a lot of concepts have been fuzzy, or at least fuzzier in previous times, and gradually trying to understand it, getting your heads around it, will improve your understanding of it. But it can't be solved by an experiment, or I mean, there is no concrete empirical evidence that would settle a conceptual dispute. So we have to live with disagreements, and then hopefully the approaches that turn out more fruitful will become more dominating.
For sure.
And that can take a long time, but there is a hope, I think.
Yeah, in 1,000 years, they will know. One thing that really, though, like when I started reading about eudaimonia, one thing that really struck my mind is that once you understand a bit more about eudaimonia, at least my perspective of what well-being is and happiness is has been broadened since I've started to read about eudaimonia. And if we look at some of the, from my understanding, contemporary, like psychologists like Waterman, which is mentioned, and also Riff and others, like Riff, for example, has some components that's important for a good life, like autonomy, for example, like being able to handle your life, being able to handle your environment, and personal growth and all these kinds of things, which are, they're just important. It can't be just the feelings. There's other, or it can be. I think somebody might argue, but I mean, there's other important aspects of a good life that is more than feelings, kind of.
Yeah, and I do, of course, agree with that. But I think one of the problems is the creation of lists, because there are too many possibilities. I mean, there are probably thousands. I mean, people have counted many hundreds of lists of important things in your life, and without any structure, theory or overarching ideas about goodness, then you can just keep on making lists. And Seligman, for example, has his 5 dimensions of well-being, and DC and Ryan with the self-determination theory have 3 dimensions, and there are endless. I mean, there are literally no end to the number of lists. And some of the frustration I have had when reading this literature is all the different lists that people create and come up with. Maslow had his list, and Roger had his list, and Erich Fromm. I mean, name it. You name. I mean, most people have their favorite lists, and there is no way to solve or decide which list is better. So again, I think if you look to Aristotle and his idea about the taxonomy, that I think is the way to move, because
what does that mean? The taxonomy.
Yeah, a taxonomy is interesting because it's a structure of things in the world. And again, Aristotle's very smart idea was that if you start with the most important things and divide it in 2, and then you divide those 2 in 2, and then you go on, you have an extremely efficient way of sorting out the world. And one good example is, the game 20 questions. So I think of something, and a group of people try to guess what I'm thinking of. And if the group is clever, they can within 20 questions figure out what I was thinking. And there are millions of things that I can be thinking of at the moment. And nevertheless, by categorizing or dividing things into broad categories to begin with, you eliminate half the world. So is it alive or is it dead? Well, half the world is now eliminated, and you can go on like that. And that is the big benefit of a taxonomy. And it has to be grounded in theory, and that is, I think, the weak spot. There are no good theories about well-being or what is good, besides very brief thing. And people, rather than building that theory, start making lists.
Right.
And I have my list and you have your list, and we can agree that all the points or elements on that list is important. It is important to feel free. It's important to have your needs met. It is important to achieve something. It is important to feel good, blah, blah, blah. But how to make it a coherent system? Well, I think you have to start with a taxonomy. And in my taxonomy, there are two extremely important ways that lives are organized, and one of them has to do with stability. I mean, if you think of all the things in your body and my body that need some kind of stability, the temperature, the heart rate, the blood pressure, blah, 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 and without some mechanism that regulate that stability, we would die immediately. I mean, there are sometimes very small margins about, for example, body temperature or pulse or heart rate and what have you. But at the same time, people need to change. I mean, you can't only stay the same, and it goes from being a baby to a grown-up, or also change mentally, and you learn things and you change your attitudes and so on. But the change part is different from the stability part. And when you asked about pleasure, I would say that the main function that pleasure has is to signalize to us that there is a stability re-established. So you are hungry and you eat and you feel pleasure because now you are not hungry anymore. It means that the body has got the nutrition it needs. And that is good, but it won't help you when it comes to develop some kind of skills, for example, which is necessary for you to have an active life. And sometimes that skill takes a lot of effort. It takes some pain. I mean, you have to endure an unpleasant state for a period of time, sometimes for many days, sometimes for a couple of hours. But that is also necessary. So the combination between what I think of the hedonic part of a good life, namely the stability that we feel as satisfied or satisfying or pleasant, on the one hand, very important, but there is also important to have the ability to develop as a human being in many different ways. But the point is that there are different mechanisms regulating the stability part. The stability has to do with pleasure and satisfaction, whereas the growth part has to do with the fascination of learning, with being surprised about something you didn't expect to happen, and so on.
Right.
So for me, that is the difference between hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. But
so just to understand, so a taxonomy means that there are this kind of final thing almost. But you have to correct me now. But okay, so there's this final thing, and then you break that down into subcomponents, or.
Yeah.
Could you give an example of what you're so you're saying that stability is linked to satisfaction and pleasure, and then we have the change, which is linked to other stuff. Like what is the next level in the taxonomy?
Oh, yeah. The next level is feelings. And I again think there are two categories serving different functions. So again, feeling pleasure and happiness, and to some extent joy, certainly relaxation, serves an important function of signalizing to you whether the body, or not only the body, but your state of being is okay. And if it's not, you feel some kind of tension that is signalized as unpleasantness, which drives you to drink if you are thirsty, or eat if you are hungry, rest if you're tired, and so on. But then you have a different category of feelings, which I think being interested, being engaged in something, being immersed in, or maybe a common denominator here is that you want to overcome a challenge. I mean, there is a challenge ahead and you really want to manage. I mean, you want to overcome that challenge. If there is a challenge and you don't care, then nothing happens. I mean, then you avoid it. If your car breaks down and you don't care about cars, you call someone to fix it. If you are a mechanic, you probably dive into the problem and find some kind of good feelings by solving the problem. And the point is that when you ask people what that feeling is, what it feels like, they don't say pleasure. I mean, it's not pleasant, but there is something else.
Yeah.
And people appreciate it. People value that other feeling. So it should be included in this taxonomy. So that is one out of several elements at the second level, if you like. And I think for hedonic well-being, life satisfaction is another one, because that is an evaluation that is not based on what you feel, but how you judge things. I mean, you can be satisfied with a peaceful world, for example, not that you feel particular pleasure by the fact, but it satisfies you.
Right.
So it's something different, but it still has to do with something that has been accomplished. You're not satisfied by being on your way to something. And very interesting, for example, studies shows that people who are satisfied, you can ask them to make lists about what they would like to do, and they generate a long list of things that they would like to do, but they don't fulfill them. There is something about being satisfied that is kind of demotivating you from the effort it takes to reach goals. So at the other hand, you don't have the satisfaction part, but you have what I think is not a judgment about being good or bad, but doing right or wrong, and some kind of wisdom that you can develop that change the way you look at your life and the way you eventually then feel about the activities that you do. And I have a very simple maybe example, and people might object to it as well, but I believe, I'm not a vegetarian, but I guess that when some people become vegetarians, they realize that the way we treat animals is terrible. And I won't eat meat because of the lack of animal welfare. And then I guess that people don't feel pleasure by eating meat anymore. As one example, and I guess there are others, that you realize that what I used to do or what I used to believe in is simply wrong, and then you don't like it anymore. And that is a different kind of judgment than satisfaction, which is about is this good or bad or not. So right, wrong is slightly different from good or bad, and so the eudaimonic part of judgments have to do more with right and wrong than with good and bad.
Right. One thing that I found interesting now when you talked about your taxonomy is, so do you link this to human nature as well? That we need to develop and we need to do stuff to survive or to reproduce, and we need to keep ourselves just, alive, kind of. Do you link it to human nature as well, or do you link it to something else, this taxonomy?
No, I definitely think that it is a way of describing human nature. And again, this stability change part is something that every living organism has to deal with, because even the simplest life forms develop in a way, and perhaps not single cells organisms develop too much, but once organisms becomes more complicated, they develop during their lifetimes, and complicated organisms or animals as humans, they need to develop a whole series of skills, and so in order to survive. Of course, if you are a hunter and gatherer, you need hunting skills, and you need to know what kind of plants to collect,
exactly.
and so on. But there are a lot of other things. I mean, our curiosity for figuring things out is an extremely strong motivator. I mean, people can go on entire lives.
Just look at us sitting here.
Yeah. Look at us. We enjoy following an idea.
Yeah.
And you can, neuroscientists, they have now discovered how these ideas are connected with rewarding systems, and they can explain why it is so stimulating to discuss ideas. But certainly develop ideas and then discover some kind of lack of understanding or some mismatch between something, or there are a million things that actually fascinates us without creating pleasure. And that's the important thing,
exactly.
I believe. So here you have a series of things that are at the level of measurements that belong to different categories, and the reason they belong to different categories is because of this taxonomy, and the taxonomy is grounded in the idea that we have to keep stable in some situation, and we have to change from baby to grown up, and from ignorant to knowledgeable, and so on.
Right. So it's in a way it's a kind of a new version of Aristotle's way of you looking at it, from my understanding, that he was kind of like, there is like a way for us to live, but more from a contemporary stance.
Yes, I mean, very roughly, that is correct, because there is something about human nature you can't neglect. But then again, Aristotle, he didn't know about Darwin.
Exactly.
I mean, he thought that,
exactly.
Yeah, nature was one thing and deviations were errors. Whereas after Darwin, we know that variation is part of what life is about. I mean, we change all the time. So variation are not errors. Variations are part of nature and part of being alive. And again, there are a lot of things that are natural for us. That's part of human nature that we don't consider as good. So it's not to say that we can just follow the nature. We have to, and that is the eudaimonic part again, right, wrong kind of thing. What is a right way to change and what is the wrong way to change? And their wisdom comes in as an element, and satisfaction won't help you, because satisfaction answer a different kind of question.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But I found it fascinating that that he and maybe you as well, like, think that there perhaps could be a science of the good life. That is how I understand it. Is that correct, that Aristotle thought that it could be kind of a science of the good life?
Yeah. I believe he did that, and I think some of those ideas are. At least some biologists, for example, agrees with Aristotle, and then again back to this idea about the telos, or the goal.
Yeah.
Because according to Dawkins and evolution theory, evolution has no goal. There is nothing that evolution will. I mean, it doesn't aim at something, but everything in it aims at something, and then I think that there are good aims and bad aims, but it's really hard to specify. I mean, everything depends on everything else, and that's just why we don't have natural laws in biology, because you don't have the law-like effects that you find in among planets, for example. You don't find that among living things, and particularly not by humans. For example, if I can take an illustration for literature, you can ask people to play a game, the prisoner dilemmas games, for example, where you have to consider whether you should cooperate or not. And then you can say, well, this game, people, this is called a community game. And if you call the community game, 75% of people choose to collaborate. Or you can just have another group of people similar to the first, but you say this game is called the Wall Street game. And then only 30% collaborate. So just this single word decides whether we collaborate or compete. And of course the collaboration is almost always better. It's almost always better. But there are so small distinctions between whether we prefer one thing over another. And of course, both are within our nature in a way. I mean, we can compete and we can collaborate, but in so many instances, all indications for goodness points to collaboration rather than competition. And that, I think, is an argument. It's vague. You can't predict precisely every single step along the way. But in general, there are so many things that works better when you collaborate. You feel better. You achieve more. You create less conflict. You create less losers. There are so many benefits that people, I guess, would in general agree is indicators of something good.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess and that is also one thing I think that Aristotle also mentioned, that even if you know it or not, having relationships is good for you, kind of. That I think that is also one of the things that if we could tell somebody that they're not doing something right, that Aristotle, I guess, would say that, okay, no, you should focus more on your relationships, because like that is good for you. And I don't know if it's just good for you or if it's good for you and good for them. But at least I think, from my understanding, that he mentioned that it's good for the person itself, that even if the person knows it or not.
Yeah, I guess that is debated a lot. It's good for you or not. And if you push the argument that Aristotle had about that you are, even if you have the right approach to life or the right kind of wisdom, virtues, then even being tortured is good for you. And that, I think, is wrong. I mean, being tortured is terrible. But I think you know more about some of the details in that insights that was kind of in accordance with what Aristotle said, but more details. I mean, we know it better and we know more about it. And I think sometimes that we have something called shared intentionality, that we want to do something together.
Yeah.
And if you want to do something together, your joy is becoming my joy. I mean, it's not that I just feel accept that you have a good time and that's good for you, but I myself also feel. I mean, my emotions are changed as well, and the same for pain and things like that. So it's truly something that we share together, and that can also be goals that we share them together. And very important, if you have the same goals and you collaborate, what do you do with the gain? You share it. I mean, if we are together with something, we have a series of different understanding of justice and how to share a common gain. But if you do it on your own, you keep it. So again, the way we look at resources depends on how these resources are made, if they are made, and if they are made as a part of a collaborating project, we share it. If they are made as an individualistic project, you don't share it.
Yeah.
And then it goes back to how do we want society to be loved? Would we like a series of individuals who think they do things on their own and keep it? Or do we like to have collaboration and communities that do things together and then also share it with pleasure? I mean, the difference between sharing something that you think you have made yourself and sharing something that you realize you've done with other is very different.
Yeah.
So it can brings you a lot of joy to share things, and it can brings you sorrow. I mean, it depends on how these things are come about and so on.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Joar, it's been very, very interesting talking to you. I know that we already, the clock is already a bit past what we set up from the start, but it's been really, really fascinating. I would just like to ask you before we end, like, what would you say is like a key takeaway or key takeaways from our discussion here today?
The key message, I think, is good lives are important. I mean, stick to what is really, really important in life. And that kind of help you prioritize what you spend your time on and how you think about things that happens in your life. And for me, if you take things seriously, it becomes better. I mean, everything that we consider good, I think, has something to do with people who take what they do seriously. And I think that we should take good lives and good societies seriously, because a lot of what we do in our everyday lives are just means to reach that goal. And then it's easy to step wrong if you don't keep in mind this goal, this telos, namely that what we do, we try to do because it is good somehow. It must be something good for us and for the societies.
Very interesting. Again, big thank you for coming on and sharing your thoughts and your knowledge about all this. It's really been fun talking to you. So big thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.